Hi everybody, today I'll be talking about F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom and how it can relate to the current global pandemic and crisis known as the coronavirus or the Covid-19 virus. And I want to preface the video by saying that the coronavirus is an extremely serious crisis going on in the world right now, and that it's not to be taken lightly. It's affecting many communities, nations, and families, and that stay safe, stay healthy, and it's a topic that I want to talk about, though, and I think is actually important because Hayek published The Road to Serfdom in 1944, in the middle, or actually near the end of, another global crisis known as the Second World War. And Hayek wrote this book in part as a warning to the Western Allies, sort of arguing that they should not try to pursue or continue the economic and even social central planning policies that they were using during the war in order to win the war after the crisis of the Second World War had subsided. And I think that this is relevant because a lot of countries, specifically for my discussion, the United States, is currently pursuing a lot of government-heavy policies in order to relieve or end the crisis that is the coronavirus or COVID-19 virus. Now, I'm not going to comment on the validity or even the morality of such policies, of sort of the government stepping into areas or dimensions of life that they usually don't do. And I'm not going to say whether or not that's a good policy for ending the crisis. I'm not going to say whether or not that's a moral policy, in order to end the crisis. What I'm more concerned with talking about is how we should view these policies while they're in place, and more importantly, how we should view such policies after the crisis has subsided, which will hopefully be very soon. Now, what policies am I talking about? Well, other countries, and specifically the United States, at the state, federal, and local level, have been implementing policies by the government, as I said, in areas that the government usually doesn't step into. One example would be the right of assembly, or the freedom of assembly. Many governments, whether it be state, local, or federal, have instituted things such as, they've made recommendations that people shouldn't meet 25 or more people, or 10 or more people, or 7 or more people. And in some places they've even shut down things such as restaurants, malls, schools, bars, gun stores, in an effort to, in various ways, make us get through this crisis safer and faster. And there's also economic policies, a lot of economic policies, that has been proposed or even implemented at the state, federal, and local level in order to fight the pandemic. One very obvious example would be the part-time or temporary UBI, or Universal Basic Income, that some in D.C., including the President Trump, have proposed. And the idea there would be to give Americans a one-time paycheck of $1,000, maybe two-time paycheck, in order to give them some money and stimulate the economy, because in addition to the actual virus crisis, we're dealing with a parallel and even causal crisis, which is our economic downturn, very likely due to the crisis. And a lot of people are out of work, and our daily lives are disrupted, and there's the supply chain of goods has been interfered with. So there's a lot of economic policies to try to sort of halt the brakes on the crisis that's going on, and hopefully make us get through it easier and sooner. Now, like I said, I'm not going to say whether or not these policies are good, but I do think it's important that we recognize these policies as part-time policies, or temporary policies, only to be instituted during the crisis, during the time of crisis. And I actually was influenced into making this video because I saw a tweet that I'll now read by a man named Cliff Maloney. I don't know who that is, but he tweeted a Hayek quote. He tweeted out, "Emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded. F.A. Hayek." In other words, it is during a time of crisis when governments, whether trying to do the good thing with good intentions or maybe even with bad intentions, have historically stamped on the individual rights, socially and economically, of individuals or even of minority groups, whether political minority or whatever type of minority. Similar examples from, I'll give you a fiction and a nonfiction, would be from nonfiction, the idea in the Roman Empire of the Republic of Consuls, and the idea that during a time of crisis, of warfare, they'd elect a part-time emperor, a consul, such as Cincinnatus, in order to temporarily take control as a dictator in order to guide Rome through the war, through the crisis. And the idea was that after the crisis had subsided, that dictator would voluntarily step down and relieve their emergency powers. That's a story, for example, of Cincinnatus. He famously went back to his plow after saving Rome. And that story is also paralleled by George Washington, who was an admirer of Cincinnatus and the Cincinnatus story. And from fiction, not to use a sort of light-hearted example about a very serious topic, but I think it's a valid example, is Chancellor Palpatine in the Star Wars saga doesn't give up his emergency power and uses the Clone Wars as a crisis in order to gain more power. So anyways, the point is that during times of crisis, whether with good intentions or bad intentions, drastic measures need to be taken. And one, we should be wary of those drastic measures, whether or not they, push too far. And two, and I think the more important consideration is that such drastic measures not be continued or replicated after the crisis has passed. And that was Hayek's fear, I think, as I said, during World War II. Because, during the war effort, the allies, the Western allies such as Great Britain and the United States, were centralizing their economies and even to a certain extent their societies in order to win the war. So I'm just going to read, I think, two quotes from Hayek's Road to Serfdom to sort of supplement the idea that this was Hayek's purpose for writing the book. The first will be from actually the 1956 foreword to the edition. So in that 1956 foreword, Hayek wrote, "What I had thus seen of the origins and evolution of the various totalitarian movements made me feel that English public opinion, particularly among my friends who held advanced views on social matters, completely misconceived the nature of those movements. Even before the war, I was led by this to state in a brief essay what became the central argument of this book. But after war broke out, I felt that this widespread misunderstanding of the political systems of our enemies, and soon also of our new ally, Russia, constituted a serious danger which had to be met by a more systematic effort. Also, it was already fairly obvious that England herself was likely to experiment after the war with the same kind of policies which I was convinced had contributed so much to destroy liberty elsewhere. Thus, this book gradually took shape as a warning to the socialist intelligentsia of England." So as you heard there, Hayek wrote the book in part as a warning against the sort of more centralized, more socialist policies that might be needed during a pandemic. And then in the actual Road to Serfdom, in the introduction to it, he wrote, "It is not to the Germany of Hitler, the Germany of the present war, that England and the United States bear yet any resemblance. But students of the currents of ideas can hardly fail to see that there is more than a superficial similarity between the trend of thought in Germany during and after the last war and the present current of ideas in the democracies. There exists now in these countries certainly the same determination that the organization of the nation, which has been achieved for purposes of defense, shall be retained for the purposes of creation." And that's really, I think, the most important part, is that the central policies used during the Second World War by the Western Allies for the purposes of defense, Hayek feared, would be retained for the purposes of creation. And by creation, he means that central planning would be retained once it had been used to win the war for foreign policy, for domestic policy, whether it be social and or economic policy domestically. And I think it's important that during the coronavirus, as we consider what policies need to be taken, what steps need to be taken in order to get us through the pandemic faster and easier, we also one, make sure that that doesn't come at the price of liberty, and two, more importantly, I think, that even if such measures are necessary during the pandemic, that such measures are not continued or even replicated after the pandemic subsides. You already hear people saying that. I saw one tweet that was saying that it took a global pandemic for the U.S. to recognize basic human rights, by which it meant either universal basic income or free healthcare or something like that. So I think it's important that we look at these policies sort of with a wary eye, we take them with a grain of salt, and that especially after the pandemic subsides, we be careful not to go down the road to serfdom. Thank you for watching.